All right, we're finally back. Time to get my whiskey. And tonight, I'm gonna put a record on the background. Mostly just for a little background music for me. So we got a fresh crack tonight, Old Granddad. For my money, the best bang for your buck whiskey, or bourbon at least, that's out there. It's like $30, 114 proof, and it tastes fantastic. So yeah, it was kind of a crazy Christmas holiday season. My daughter's first birthday was the 21st of December. Then my birthday is the 23rd. And Christmas, all coupled by uh, just about everybody getting COVID during that time. So I took a few weeks off. Just didn't work out. But we're back. If I can ever get this bottle open at least. Come on. Alright, finally. Mm, man, that's good stuff. Paul, what's up? Good to see you. Do a nice healthy pour. Also, if I stop to eat in the middle of this, I apologize. I got some snacks over here because I haven't had a chance to eat yet today. Tuesdays are just kind of crazy. So, all right. All right. Might as well get started. So tonight, it's going to be all about timing with these cars. Um, a lot of this, a lot of this will apply to other platforms as well. Some of it's just like my overall ideology of how I tune cam and ignition timing. Um, but a lot of it is some goofy things that I personally do with these PCMs because I can't stand the logic, and my philosophy in general is whenever possible simplify. I think that's you know especially useful with these because you have seemingly 1,000 more tables that are necessary. Um, and then, of course, there's like 1,000 tables that we don't have that do seem necessary. So, but yeah, simplify whenever possible. It's kind of my philosophy. Um, I'll start with my disclaimer always. What I show you in these maps, use it to learn and understand. Don't use it to copy because not everything in here, in fact, most of the things in here for this Whiskey Wednesdays map are not anything that I would run on an actual vehicle. Some of them are, but you don't know which is which, and I really don't want anybody blowing their shit up. So, again, watch, listen to learn, to understand, not to copy what's on the screen. All right? So, if everybody's got that, we'll be fine. So, I'm listening to Ike Riley in the background on this vinyl. And we saw him in concert randomly a couple months ago. And it was fantastic. I never heard him even before in my life. And I'm like, it's good music. All right, let's get to it. So we got the editor view. So what I'll start with is I'll start with ignition timing. Um, it's something everybody's no doubt familiar with, and it's what in these. So with these ECUs, I this is where the most added complexity, um, one of the most added complexity pieces of it that I just I don't see why they do what they do. And what I'll say is, for a ton of people, the biggest complaint on all of these cars is one day it feels fast, the next day it feels terrible, or even I just did a pull and my car felt great, and then I did another pull and my car felt slow as hell. Um, I've noticed a lot of that for me personally. Did come from the way the timing tables were being applied. Okay, and when I say that, we'll get into these, but you have your base timing tables here, but then you also have you have your fuel adders, adders and multipliers in these tables. Okay, now these are used specifically during your PE mode, um, so your power enrichment. Um, what I see though is that oftentimes these tables are not used at all. Okay, and what I'll see is somebody will go do a pull and they'll be in power enrichment, things will look fine, and all of a sudden it's running their base table or lower. This is when I see cars that have clearly extremely high EGTs because their manifolds are glowing red. You see that a lot. Um, and cars that all of a sudden feel really slow, even though there's no knock. Okay. And there is no knock. It's not that. And you don't even see any knock retard necessarily. But what I do see is just not running the ignition timing that it's supposed to. So quickly, I'll go through how I got around that and how I've been able to maintain exactly the ignition timing curve that I want in every single scenario. All right. So we'll go to the base high octane map first. That is what your car will almost 100% of the time run off of, provided you have good gas. So we'll go there first. Wait for that to open. Okay. Now we'll start by looking at the bone stock map. Okay. So stock map, you see you see some peaky timing over 40 degrees. Then it starts dropping rapidly. Fine, whatever. It's not ideal, but we'll leave that alone. What I really want to look at down here is what you're looking at from your base timing table. Okay, your base timing table under the best conditions, you have negative timing requests all the way up to 4,400 RPM, and you get a little tiny bump, and it basically stays 0, 1 degree, right? And then we're going to go back out, and we're going to assume we're on gasoline. Okay. So this would be like a 93 octane map. And now this, again, this adds degrees of timing to your base table based on when you're in power enrichment mode. So I go wide open throttle. My air mass is, let's say, somewhere in the 1.3 to 1.5 range. And what it's going to do is say, okay, add 3 degrees, 2.5 degrees, 2.5 degrees, and so on to my base timing table. Okay, now one of the things that you can do to, as you're just kind of, building up through this, is you copy down your adder. Okay, so these are adding 3 or 2.5, 3 degrees to your base table. Then you can go back to your high octane table, your base table, okay, and you can then, I think we copied from 3600, right? So you can then go to paste special and add, okay? And what that's going to do is it's going to show you what your actual overall requested timing advance is, okay? The combination of the tables, it'll show you this, right? So with that said, why run an additional table as an adder for the same cells that you're already going to be covering here in your base table? Okay, spark air mass goes up to 1.6 in your base table, goes up to 1.6 in your adder tables, right? So what is the purpose? You are never going to be in these high air mass values and not in power enrichment, ever. So what is the point of running a low amount of timing here and then adding in your adder table and then having to combine the two whenever you're trying to do your modifications and calculations and things like that, right? So what I do, and you can tell by the table here by that higher numbers, but so what I do is I go to my my PE adder tables, and I just zero them out completely. Okay? No reason for them. Creates more inconsistency. It's one less calculation the PCM needs to do. All right, so I zero those out. Same thing with the alcohol one, zero that out. All right, so we'll go back one last time to our base table. Now this is a pretty typical table that I would design for to start with a good 93 octane, right? So not a Cali 91, like we're talking a decent 93 octane, and this is right around at the top 10.5 degrees where I like to stay for safety on 93. All right. A couple of things that I want to point out while we're doing this. One, through my peak torque range. Now this obviously changes with different cars. Okay. But through your peak torque range, you basically want to have no timing, especially on this platform. But you basically have no advance. And then I start creeping up after that, ending at 10.5 degrees by 6,800. That's usually where usually I whatever my target. So if I'm saying I'm going to run 10 degrees of timing, okay, that does not mean I'm running 10 degrees of timing across the board. That means my peak ignition timing, my peak advance is 10 degrees. So if I say I'm going to shoot for around 10 degrees of timing, um, I'm using that from my perceived red line for that um, specific setup, right? So if I'm on a stock turbo and I'm looking at the red line or the limit of that turbo, I'm gonna make sure that by 5600 6000 rpm, by 6000 rpm, I'm at my peak amount of timing. When I'm looking at my personal setup that makes power, over 7500 rpm, well, now I have some more room to play with because the VE, the volumetric efficiency of the engine is so much greater now in that high rev range. So you have more room to play with. Okay. Um, as just kind of an overall, we talked a lot in the last video about how to kind of get those curves that you want. It's all dependent on the exact setup you have, but for a stock turbo car where the efficiency of the turbo drops off very quickly at high RPM, what you can do is then you run very low timing in the peak efficiency area of that turbo where it can make a lot of boost, a lot of torque very quickly, and you don't want to add to that cylinder pressure with any ignition advance. But then where most of those cars drop off hard because the turbo's out of its efficiency range, you can start adding ignition timing from that point forward and really make up for the lack in cylinder pressure made by the boost that the turbo can't maintain. Um, the CFM is not being put into the engine, on those tiny turbos at high RPM. So you can make up with some timing for that, and you can get a much flatter curve across the board. Okay, so that's kind of an overview on that. And then one other thing that you'll see that's probably may seem a little goofy, but is how I run these numbers all on a diagonal. And like I said before, we're looking for a consistent timing curve. I want to be able to say every time that when I set up a car to go out and start at 0 degrees of ignition advance at at peak torque 3500 RPM or so, and I want to target 10 degrees of timing on that car. I never want a situation where, based on your air mass numbers at RPM and things like that, I'm not running the timing that I want. Right? So what I do is, as you get higher on the RPM, especially with small turbos and also with PI, so small turbos and PI are the biggest reasons you really want to focus on this. What you'll start having happen is, as your RPM goes up, your air mass starts to drop some. And the last thing that you want is to say, okay, at my peak air mass, I'm going to start at 10 degrees and I'm just going to interpolate vertically. Next thing I know, well, I'm not holding 1.4 grams air mass anymore. I'm at 7,000 RPM. I'm down to 1.13, and now I'm not asking for 10.5 degrees anymore. I'm asking for 15 degrees. And then all of a sudden, you just ran 5 degrees more than you wanted to, and bad things happen. Okay, so in all my timing tables, again, especially stock turbos being pushed, and especially on PI cars, you want to make sure that you're taking these targets up to low air mass values. Okay, so hopefully that's all making sense so far. So then the secondary part of that, really the last part of that ignition timing piece, is what do we do for flex fuel, right? And that's why I like kind of simplifying where I can with getting rid of the PE tables. So I just have my base, and then the only real significant adder table is for my flex fuel. So that's what we'll get into next. B-side time. And also, how sick is this record? All white. All right. So, what do we do now for flex fuel? Okay, everybody I'm sure knows at this point that you run a higher ethanol content. It can take more timing. It can take more boost. Um, there's just a much higher octane, so you can run more aggressively, right? So all we do is we take our high octane table, we go and we have our flex fuel table. Now this table just dictates how many degrees of timing are added when you have ethanol in the tank. Okay. So the only things I have to worry about when I am doing these timing tables are what does my base table look like? And that's typically standard across the board, except for my wide open throttle region gets tweaked based on the setup, based on how the car responds, based on the octane level there. Okay, so I have my base table, and then I have my alcohol adder table. And in the alcohol adder table, anything that is not wide open throttle, I personally leave stock. I've tried it different ways. Um, I'm gonna leave the efficiency side of things on this one up to the engineers. So part throttle, adding a degree, taking away a degree here and there for ethanol, fine. I leave that stock. That's just my personal my personal opinion on that. Do with that what you will. But what's nice about this is, so like I showed before, you can do a copy and add to figure out, okay, what am I going to run on 93? We know that's our base table and it's going to be the same every time. Now on E85, what do I want to run then? So if we go here and we can skip all the way to our 6,000 RPM, right? Because there's no additions before that. In this map, I'm not saying that's how you should run it, but in this map, we start adding at 6,000 RPM. Okay, so we're going to go back to our high octane table. All right, go to our last row, wide open throttle, 6,000 RPM, and we're going to paste special and add. Okay, so what this is doing for me is, what I'm looking at is, I was on 93 octane. I was running a peak of 10.5 degrees of timing, and on full E85, I'll be running 14 degrees of timing. That's it. It's very simple. It's when you need to make changes, you can make them quickly. Um, you know, usually on E85, all things being equal, around 5 degrees more timing peak is doable. I That's just a baseline. That's just a starting point. Um, so what's nice is most of your additions or tweaks or changes can just be done to your base table, and you don't have to do anything else. And the reason you would make changes to your timing tables are, you're seeing knock at certain RPMs and it's actually real knock, or your torque curve is not exactly what you'd like, and it wants a little bit more timing at a different RPM, usually in the higher RPM, especially with the stock turbo. Okay. So now that we've gone over that, um, the one more thing that I do want to go through, um, you're gonna have your flex fuel multiplier table. Okay. So what this is, when I said you have your base table and then you have your alcohol table that tells you how much you want to add when you're running E85, what that actually is, um, it's using this table um, to kind of slide that scale where you want it. Okay, what I mean by that is if you look at this table, your alcohol composition is here at the top. So this would be E10. So this is what we get from the pump. So at E10, we should be adding nothing from our alcohol adder table. At E30, we should add 50% of what's requested in the alcohol adder table. At E50, we should add 75%. And E70 and up, we should add 100% of what's in the alcohol adder table. Okay, this um, for tuners and everybody, this is really helpful because if you're only ever going to run E50, let's say you're never going to be able to go above that because you don't plan on putting in a low pressure fuel pump, or you don't planning on doing a 6-port or PI or meth or anything like that, right? You're on stock fuel system. You're going to stick between E40, E50, and have a great time. What I like to do is I would go in here and I would set my E50 to 1 degree, or I mean, I'm sorry, to 1, which is 100%. Okay, which would allow me to do all of my tuning from my 93 map, which is my base, and then all of my other tuning would be right at my E50 map, right? So I don't have to do any other calculations. I can say, okay, if I go into my flex fuel map, now where this would have looked and said, okay, run 70% of 3.5 degrees added, add 70% of 3.5 instead of the full 3.5. Now I can say, okay, if I'm working with a car that's E40, E50, it's looking directly at this table again. It's not trying to do a whole bunch of extra calculations and interpolation between percentages and things like that. Okay, so this flex fuel multiplier is definitely very helpful. It can just make it a lot easier for you to see numbers directly for what they are, and not have to kind of do extra calculations for yourself while you're trying to make these little tweaks. Okay, it helps a guy tune in his own car. It helps tuners who can flip things around faster and make small adjustments without having to kind of do a lot of extra. There's not a lot of extra processing power when you do it that way. I won't get into the low octane, the rest of these tables. I'll just say I set high and low octane the same. There's enough other protection mechanisms that the low octane table, I'm sure I'll catch heat for that, and you don't have to listen to that if you don't want to. You can set the low octane table degrees below what your high octane is. It's up to you. It's fine. I just set it to be exactly the same. All right. All right. So before we get to the next one. All right. So last thing I think on this page before we leave, this spark smoothing. This is an absolute I don't even know a word that is good enough to describe this. It's an absolute killer for manual transmission cars. Spark smoothing, it takes over and it tries to prevent any jerkiness in the driveline. It tries to prevent any hard shifts. It I believe also, along with the acceleration-based fuel cut tables that we went over in the last one, it will also try to smooth, which means reduce timing, um, based on extreme rates of acceleration. So any manual transmission vehicle, if you want it to run well, if you want it to run consistently, if you want to be able to have a hard shift, um, that does not cut timing in between shifts, if you want to have, um, I mean, you can't really launch these yet. It's still a disaster trying to build boost off the line. But if you want to have a chance to keep from your ignition timing totally tanking when you leave the line, spark smoothing has got to be disabled. Okay, it's a totally different vehicle to drive once you get rid of that. I can tell you that beyond a shadow of a doubt. Okay. I feel like there's actually one more table similar to that I'm forgetting right now for whatever reason. I don't know. I don't think I should get into. Yeah, I won't. You know what? I won't get into minimum timing and crackle tunes and stuff like that now. Maybe I'll do that could be its whole other one, that I can do at a later time. But just know that you can do a lot with your minimum timing, and so that would be your minimum spark here. With these tables, you can do a lot to create boost off the line. You can do a lot to dial in your crackle tunes, things like that. That can all be done with timing as well. Just while I'm thinking about it, though, just want to see if I can remember what other table I'm remembering or outside of torque shaping. That is the other one. Okay, torque shaping, manual transmission cars. At least I don't know actually if that one is specific to manual trans. Blah, 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 torque shaping. Looks like it's actually not. So that one looks like it's actually shared between manual and the autos. So I can't say for the autos, but for the manual transmission, torque shaping, turn that off as well. That will do essentially the same type of thing that we just talked about. Same thing we talked about with the sparks smoothing. The spark smoothing won't allow basically a lot of torque created by added timing to smooth things out, and then the torque shaping will reduce your requests to not allow those same type of things. So they kind of work together. Again, I'm not sure what it's like to turn that off on an automatic transmission car and how that plays together, but on a manual, turn both of them off every time. Okay, so the next thing that I wanted to go over as far as timing goes is cam timing. Okay, cam timing has obviously come a very long way because in years past, you had everything was fixed, and when you were putting your engine together, you could advance the cams, retard the cams, to kind of change your overall curve from start to finish. Now we have the fantastic ability to just map the position of our camshafts. I know when I was starting with the Mazdas, it was intake cam only, was incredibly beneficial, especially on big turbo cars, but incredibly beneficial because it can increase your dynamic compression ratio in the places that you want it to. That will spool a turbo quicker. That'll make the car feel more responsive. That will take areas of your throttle that may have felt dead before, even with other tuning, and it'll take it and feel like it's actually made the engine itself more responsive. So the throttle and the engine more connected. So variable cam timing is fantastic when used correctly. Um, it's absolute hot garbage when it's used for. Maybe I shouldn't say that. Backing up a second. So it's hot garbage if you're trying to have the uh, best performance car, um, and instead you have GM who is trying to achieve the lowest emissions and the highest gas mileage, which they actually in a lot of their mapping that I've seen, definitely with the early models. And actually no, I think it's been every model year that I've seen. Um, they don't even do things that necessarily work for gas mileage with the cam timing. They definitely do stuff that is emissions based as far as cam timing goes. So in general, no matter if you have a variable cam, you have a fixed cam, um, if you advance both cams, you're going to create more mid-range torque, less top end. If you retard both cams, you're going to do exactly the opposite. If you leave your exhaust cam fixed and um, you advance your intake cam, you're going to get a mix in general of that, and vice versa. So that does hold true from every platform I've ever worked on, and this one not being any different. Um, so the ideal scenario, because you have two camshafts that you can request to move wherever you want at whatever time you want, what you would want to do to get the best curve is you would want to advance both cams on spool up, getting into peak torque, and then you start retarding them, and then by high RPM, they're full retard. So that'll give you the best of both worlds, is the idea behind it, and it really does work well. Okay, so as we get into these tables, there's some more kind of simplify wherever possible things that I talked about. So you have your desired angle for different barometric pressures. Um, you are almost always using the high baro table. Sometimes medium is what it is. Um, Depends on your location, depends on your altitude, all those things. Then you have your wide open throttle desired angle. Now, in very similar fashion to our ignition timing tables, what you'll find here, and let's go to the stock table, okay? What you'll find here is, you know, you're going to have the air mass values that are wide open throttle in your base table. So why do they need multiple tables when your wide open throttle values for air mass and RPM are all housed in this base table? Okay. And the reason that I kind of started, looking into that and that I'm harping on these things is because when we talk about these inconsistencies, this is another one that I see. I've seen so many times that it's like, I don't understand my wide open throttle exhaust cam. Let's go to wide open throttle. Right, wide open throttle. My exhaust cam is supposed to be at, let's see, it's supposed to be at 0 degrees at 6,000 RPM, but I'm seeing 12 degrees. How is that even possible? Well, it's because for whatever reason, even when you're wide open throttle, when you're in power enrichment, when everything should be following this table, sometimes it just doesn't, and sometimes it follows your base table instead. So, with that said, what I like to do in this case, you do not, let me stop again, repeat. You don't want to zero this out. That's not going to be the same as the approach for the ignition timing. What you do want to do is take your high barometric pressure table, okay, and get it where you want it, and then you'll take all your values down here, copy them, paste them into your wide open throttle table. That will guarantee that when you're wide open throttle, when you're in power enrichment, when you're making jam, you are going to have the same requests for your camshafts every time you're at that air mass level. Okay, if it decides to use your base table one time and your wide open throttle base table a second time, it's fine because they're exactly the same across the board. Okay, so that's how I set mine up. That's intake and exhaust. That's exactly how I set mine up. All right. Also makes it very easy, again, making changes, things like that, because you know, you're taking a lot of that complexity, that unnecessary complexity out of it. All right, so now that we kind of understand that, let me get into a little bit what I was saying about you know, GM doing this for, you know, EPA reasons and things like that, and where do I see that in the map? I got a little charcuterie board over here I'm munching on. I don't know if I can show this, but it's delicious and on a paper plate, so it's super fancy. Anyway. All right. So we're back to our main table. I'll go to the stock file. All right. So stock file, what we see. Now remember, let's level set baseline here. We wanted low and mid range, advance the cams, high RPM, retard the cams. That's our global kind of baseline for what we want to do on any engine that is overhead cams, any engine in general, where you can move that camshaft. Okay. Well, that doesn't make any sense if you're looking at this table, right? I mean, it makes no sense because you have the ability, if we look back at the minimum and maximum, and hopefully I'm not getting too laggy because that just took a while on my side. Okay, so you have a minimum of 0 up to 180 degrees, 128 degrees. Don't look at that. Okay, look at your wide open throttle, because remember we're using the same table. Also, you would trash your engine if you actually advanced your intake cam 128 degrees. So you have 0 to 32 degrees. Okay, 0 being park position on the intake, being the most retarded, and 32 degrees being the most advanced. So what I would assume I would see here is I would think that I would see high numbers here, close to 32, and 0 by my high RPM by my rev limit. Okay, but from the factory, that's not at all what you see. Okay, this is very high numbers down low where these areas will never be reached. Pretty high numbers low to mid, and then it just rides that out. All right. This is more what I would expect to see on a cam profile. Okay. This is high numbers, your highest numbers, low to mid range, and then fading out to nothing up top. So you're the most advanced in the low to mid range, the most retarded up top. The other thing that we'll go through, and it'll be hard to kind of compare here, so I'll just talk to it. What you see here in this kind of low air mass, mid RPM range, this is your cruising speed. This is your on the highway, cruising down the road at 40 miles an hour. These are those scenarios. Is this area right here? Okay. What you want in those scenarios for the best throttle feel and the most efficiency out of the engine is you would want to request both cams to advance. Okay, so I can tell you that exhaust cam is also advanced, during this time. So both cams to advance. So when they advance like that quickly, you're gaining a level of extra torque when you start to get just off of cruising and start to tip in on the accelerator. You're gaining that level of just added engine torque and responsiveness by advancing both of those cams. From the factory, that's not what they do at all. What they end up doing is they create overlap at that time. And while the overlap does not help any type of throttle feel or power at all, what it does do is help in your emissions. So that's where you see that. The other big thing that I just want to get through before we get off of this is what you'll basically see in we get down here, open this back up. Okay, what you'll see in the exhaust cam on this example is very different numbers. So remember, we were on the intake cam and I'm like, listen to me, this will be exactly the same on the exhaust. We're going to advance and then retard. But then we get to here and we have drastically different numbers, right? It almost looks completely the opposite. That's because it is completely the opposite. So at a high level, the intake cam is parked at the most retarded position. Okay, and when I say parked, that means when there's zeros in this table, when there's no oil flowing through the actuators to try to move the cams. That's what I mean when I say parked. So the intake cam is parked at its most retarded position, and the exhaust cam is parked at its most advanced position, and that creates the most overlap and the most safety for failures. So that's why they start them off in kind of opposite positions and park them there. So what you're seeing here is actually exactly what I said, which, I had like 24s, giant numbers on the intake cam, like 20 in the 20s, whereas here I have 0. Well, what that means is, let's say 24 is my most advanced on my intake cam, and 0 we know is the most advanced on my exhaust cam. Okay, so that means I'm advancing both cams. Then as I raise in RPM, you'll see it go down from 20s to 0 on the intake cam, but from 0 up toward the 20s on the exhaust cam. Okay, so very important to know that those work opposite of each other. And that's that's the last bit that we really need to talk about. That you can get into this tuning. Um, you know, you can spend hundreds of hours on this to fine tune the actual numbers that you want to go for on this. And the numbers that I had in there are not necessarily what I run. They're definitely not what I run on my personal car, but it was just to give an example of kind of how you advance both and then retard both, and the fact that they are opposite of each other as far as how they're depicted in the tables. All right, man, going strong there. I thought this was going to be a quick one, but I always end up talking like crazy. All right, so I have one more thing that I was going to touch on tonight, so I might as well do it. This one will actually be in fuel. Okay, so this is going to be very quick, although I say that every time. So we've talked about ignition timing. So that's your timing advance is what we talked about tonight. We've talked about your camshaft timing. One thing to know with those two play together very closely. Okay, so if you are advancing your camshafts and creating higher dynamic compression, you do not want to be advancing your ignition timing at the same time. There is a real, I can get into every technical aspect of all of this, and I hope that a lot of people do learn from these and can tune their own cars and things like that. But even if you understand every technical aspect, there really is an art to this. I cannot stress that enough. Okay, so there is a real massaging of when you want your cams to be advanced versus your ignition timing to be advanced, and how you play with those two together. It's not terribly difficult with with enough research to understand all of these different things independently of each other. You could understand that you advance cams to make more torque in the low to mid range, and you retard them up top to allow for more airflow, and you can understand that you raise your ignition timing in these areas to create more cylinder pressure. But all of these things play together, and it's really important to know that before you ever just change one thing. You really need to know the big picture and how they play together. So with all that said, there is a third piece of that, which is your fuel injection timing. Okay, so we've essentially, with our cam timing, we've changed the timing and amount of when our air is coming in. With our ignition timing, we've changed the timing of when our spark is being sparked, right? And then the last piece of that is our fuel timing, basically, okay, which is your injection timing. So there's a lot of not necessarily controversy, but controversy over whether these tables actually affect anything. I have seen that they do. I believe that they do. But all I will say from here on out is I'll explain just how it works. Okay, so I'm only going to go to one table right now. We're going to go to our SOI base. So SOI is start of injection. So that means when in the strokes am I starting my injection, okay, of the fuel. This is not something that ever mattered really with with a normally port injected car. This has become a huge thing with direct injected cars. And the reason being, and if you see these numbers, right, you're seeing in this table is 200s to up to 350, let's say. And what do those numbers mean? So those numbers are related to your actual crank revolutions and your the basically the stroke that you're in. So you have a four-stroke engine. That's a total of 720 degrees of rotation to get through a full cycle, right? So you have 180 degrees per stroke times 4 gets you to 720. Cool. Why don't we see stuff that's closer to 720 here? That's where we get into the direct injection piece of this, because with direct injection, you don't have 720 degrees to be injecting fuel. You have half of that. Okay, and so if you see a lot of calculations when you look at injector duty cycle. If you read any of my stuff on the R4 controller, which controls the 6-port PI system, stuff like that, you actually use a 2-cycle setting to figure out kind of your available fueling, all of that. It's because your injection window is cut down in half. It's really less than that, but cut down in half for argument's sake, right? So a maximum injection window here would be 360 degrees, right? Because that's half of your 720. So when you see something that's getting up to 350, you could push it to 360, let's say, that is really saying I want to start my fuel injection 350 degrees before my fixed end of the injection window. Okay, so again, you can do it this way you wish, and you can research whether these numbers actually change anything or not, because I will tell you 100% there are other tables, not necessarily ones that we always have available to us, that do modify your injection window regardless of what you have in these tables. So this truly are base tables, but in general, the closer you get to asking for a 360-degree window, the more time you have for fuel to be injected. And what does that mean? That means on a direct injected car, when you are out of fuel because you're at 6-7 milliseconds, at 6,000 RPM, 7,000 RPM, you have no more fuel at all. You can expand that window some and gain a little bit of fuel. Okay. You can also tweak these for fuel economy. You can tweak them for all kinds of stuff, but that's the general overview of how this works. There's also end of injection tables, things of that nature. Again, this is one of those things you can just, when you understand that, when you understand what your full scope of your window is and what you're trying to do with direct injection, you can go in and use these tables and these numbers as a sliding scale and do what you think will expand that window as large as possible. The at least the stock settings of this PCM will not actually in practice, in reality, let you spray into the exhaust stroke. That's something that everybody worries about. If you expand the window too much, you're basically going to be spraying fuel into an open exhaust valve. You're just spitting fuel out the exhaust, and bad things happen. Okay, the MZRs, the Mazdas, they did function that way. You could get well over 100% duty cycle and spray right out the exhaust with direct injection. This PCM really doesn't let you do that. But I do believe some of the base tables do work some of the time, but there are a lot of safety features to not let you expand that window too much, which is why I personally very much recommend auxiliary fueling, whether that be meth, whether that be 6-port, whether that be PI, depending on your setting, your setup and your goals. You can tweak all of this. You can tweak this. You can tweak your fuel pump control module. You can do all that stuff till you're blue in the face. But on a stock system, you may gain 10%, 15%. I've never met a person where 10 or 15% and be totally capped off forever was ever enough. So that's my personal feelings on that. There are a few settings at the very bottom here that do mean things. Okay, these maximum angles, the minimum gap between pulses of your injectors and your spark offset, they can be modified. They do set limits on things. I can tell you that they are part of a basically injector duty cycle limit, and above that limit, you will get just 100% available knock retard. It will not allow you to go past that. It's basically almost like a failure limit. With stock settings in here, that's approximately 30% duty cycle. It depends on the year of your car how duty cycle is actually calculated, though. On the earlier models, though, about 30%. And that was like a pain in the ass to find out. Me and Jonathan's car was running on his Evo 9 turbo, and we just couldn't figure out what was going on with the fact that he had plenty of fuel. Everything looked good, and all of a sudden there's 10 degrees of knock, and it's not real knock, and it won't go away no matter what we do. Start figuring out that what it really took was taking away a lot of the DI fuel requirement and adding a lot more from the PI to keep that duty cycle below our threshold, which on his car was 30%. Depending on how yours reads, it may read, you may be looking at double that. So I can't necessarily tell you that, but there is a duty cycle limit, and that's a duty cycle is dictated by your pulse width at your RPM for the most part. It's the easiest way to look at it. So careful with that. Watch it if you're getting like just weird knock retard that seems like it's not real, but it's a crazy amount and it's all the time. Check your injector duty cycle while that's happening and see what that looks like. Again, adding auxiliary fuel is a really easy way to bring that down. If you don't have that option or you don't want to go that route, going in and looking at these bottom parameters here, along with the start of injection and end of injection, those could give you potentially enough headroom for what you want, but probably not. You should just go with auxiliary fuel. All right. Whew. I think that was it. That's everything I wanted to get through. Oh shit! I'm shocked, but the Cavs apparently just beat the Bucks by a bunch. Cool. Well, I'm glad I got back on. I know it's been a while. I know not a lot of people can always get to these, but hopefully they're helpful. They're helpful for me just to talk it out. I have clearly a lot in my head to talk through, and I could do it for days. But yeah, I'll be back next week. I got a lot of stuff I guess for the end of this, I might as well just stay live, and I can talk through a couple maybe upcoming projects. So I have a full turbo kit that I've been working on for way too long right now. Sammy in Texas, almost done. That's coming along nice though. It would have been done forever ago, but I can never stop just tweaking to make improvements. So basically, what happened was my jig that I used for my last two manifolds was useless on this one because I wanted to make this one better. So this one took a while. So I'm doing that, but the big news is one of my old friends contacted me. We've been looking for, so Jonathan and I have been trying to get his designs and stuff that we've worked on for the fuel systems. Um, we've been trying to get those machined and manufactured for a couple years now at this point. And I got a message from one of my buddies that he could potentially do that. So we've been meeting up recently and looked at the first 3D printed prototype for our in-tank fuel pump solution that is going to house a Hellcat 535 liter per hour pump. It's going to be completely drop-in. It's nothing like the gigantic pain that the ZL1 pump upgrade is, and the ZL1 pump, while sufficient for some decent power, uh, you know, that's a 250 liter per hour pump, and this one, when it's all said and done, will produce between 460 480 liter per hour. So it's going to be a great option. I cannot wait until we're done with everything. So looked at the first prototype, took notes. Kevin took everything back. He's tweaking the program and everything. He's going to print another one. We'll make sure everything fits well and everything, and then we'll do some testing in the car, and we'll go from there. But I'm really excited about that. There will also be I'm going to be putting a Force Performance MHI turbo on my car with the 6-port. I'm going to start building downpipes. Seems like nobody wants to build downpipes right now, or they're not available. So I'm going to be doing a lot of testing with that. I'm getting back pressure, so I'm getting EMAP sensor. It's on the way. I'm building a little kit with that so that I can start recording exhaust back pressure, as I think that's a huge issue with these cars. I think EGTs and exhaust back pressure, which kind of play hand in hand. So when I get the that Force Performance turbo on the car, I'll be measuring the back pressure on that versus a stock turbo. It's kind of the plan. Let me think. Furthermore, after that, I have a big kit that I'm also building for my car. That's one of my manifolds, obviously, but that's going to have eventually a zoner rotor. I think I'm going with the 8264S. It's like a 64 millimeter turbo. That'll be like the big build. But that one is going to require finally more than just the 6-port can provide. So 6-port with a low pressure pump included. The 6-port will get you up into the low to mid 500 wheel horsepower range without a problem. But above that, you're going to need a full 4 extra injectors, so an 8-port PI system. So Kevin is also working with me on that piece. So really excited about that stuff. A lot more fueling coming this year. A lot more testing. And hopefully just in general, a lot more from the platform. So thanks everybody for watching. Hope you guys learned something. Um, Message me. This will obviously go up. It usually takes almost a day to post, but this will go up. Anything, questions you have in the comments, let me know. I'll respond as soon as I can. And until next time, yeah, enjoy a drink.